Hello, welcome to our live Q&A on climate change. We'll be taking questions from you for the next 20 or so minutes. Thanks for being here. I'm Sarah, I'm a video journalist at The Economist, and I'm here with Oliver Morton, who is one of our senior editors here and also specialises in climate science and policy. Hi, Ollie. Ollie, it's been a busy few weeks for you.
It has, yes, because we decided some time ago to do a special issue on the climate. And this week we did it, and here it is. And it's, if I say so myself, really rather fine.
And this is the first time, am I right in thinking, that we've dedicated a whole issue to one?
Yeah, it's interesting. At Christmas we do a special jolly issue with lots of interesting other stories in it, but we've never done an issue that's sort of like devoted to one subject. And even this time, what we've done, and I think this is, I was very pleased when this was what we decided to do. We haven't done this issue isn't full of only climate stories. It's not sort of like trying to be just a climate catch up.
Yeah.
But we've taken climate stories and given them prominence in every single section of the paper. So we normally have, I don't know, 13 sections, I think, if you sort of like spread it out a bit. And all of those deal with the whole world, effectively, or bits of the world. And because climate matters for the whole world and all the various different bits of the world, we went out and made sure that we had good climate stories that would be big stories in any week, and just made sure that we reported them all in this week. And so we put that together with a big editorial and a briefing that I put together and all sorts of other things. But it means that, we have stories about the Panama Canal and what will happen to it as rainfall in Panama drops. We have stories about the mourning process for a glacier in Iceland. We have stories about tycoons trying to make more money out of trying to put climate change to rights. We have a whole range of different things, but all under the whole umbrella of talking about the climate seriously and urgently.
And why have we decided that now's the time to do this?
Well, we wanted to do more about climate for a while. We do it, I think we do it well on a week-by-week basis. We wanted to make some sort of climate-y splash, and we came up with this idea of climate sort of like running through all the bits of the paper, and then we realised that if we were going to do that, we might as well do it at a time when climate was on people's minds, and this is a time when climate is on people's minds.
Very much so. And the cover is striking, but more so when you know what it actually means. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Sure. This is an idea from... Yeah, mine matches yours. How interesting. This is a visualization, and it's showing you every year from the middle of the 19th century to now. And the colours represent the difference in temperature between that year and an average temperature which was taken sometime in the middle 20th century. So what you see is in the 19th century it's cooler, and you have breaks of dark blue. And there's not much pattern through most of it, but then towards the end you start noticing that it's going really red. And this is an illustration, a strategy that was invented by a really smart climate scientist at the University of Reading, Ed Hawkins, who's looked at various ways of visualizing science, and particularly visualizing climate science, as well as doing other fun things like trying to get people to read logbooks from 19th century ships so that we can get more climate data on the 19th century. Ed came up with this idea. It's been around a fair bit online and elsewhere. Some people have it on ties. We thought it would just be a great way to show that this is about everything. Rather than have an image of one particular effect of climate, this was a way of sort of like saying the whole thing, and it helps that, it's a striking image.
You can really see the cumulative effect. And this week we've also put up a film looking at what trees can do to tackle climate change. So if you want to watch that, you can click on the eye in the top right-hand corner of the screen. We're going to go through questions from the community tab, but we're also taking questions live, so please do send them in if you have any. Ready, Ollie?
Yeah, sure.
So world leaders are gathering in New York for the UN Climate Action Summit to discuss what can be done to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And millions around the world are hitting the streets to protest today for urgent action. So we've had lots of questions from people asking just how bad climate change is. There's a lot of misunderstanding around it. Our first question is from Milan Prasad, and he asked, what are the long-term implications of rapid decline in polar ice caps?
Well, the problem with climate change when you're talking about how bad is there's really nothing to compare it to. There's nothing else that humans come up against that takes centuries and profoundly reshapes the planet. So for ice caps, if the ice caps start, well, the two things, you've got to remember the floating ice, which you have mostly in the Arctic, and you have ice that's on continents and islands, which you have in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. If the ice on Antarctica or Greenland starts to flow off it very fast, so dynamic shifts to that ice, you might see enough melting this century to see sea levels rise by 1 or maybe even 1.5 meters, which would be huge compared to anything we've seen historically. If it's more slow, then it might be sort of like more like 80 centimeters. But at the moment, sea level rise is dominated by the fact that when you warm up water, it expands, and by the melting of glaciers on land. But as this century goes on, I think it's fair to say that the melting of ice in the Arctic, ice on land in the Arctic, is going to be a big factor in that. And of course, that's what it means to someone like me who lives near the Thames estuary in London. In the Arctic, it means your entire world is changing really rapidly. All the ways that animals behave, all the habitats for animals are changing. That doesn't mean they're all going extinct, but it means that there are new stresses on them and on how they interact with people. The permafrost is melting, which means that in the Arctic a lot of foundations are in permafrost, so everything goes a bit higgledy-piggledy. And ways of life are changing really rapidly because the Arctic warms much faster than the rest of the planet.
Really interesting, and we have a piece on ice caps.
We do. We have, and we also have a piece about the question of some people in Russia thinking that, hey, Siberia a bit warmer. That sounds kind of good, and looking at how that kind of good-sounding thing compares to the other things that Russia is facing in a warmer world.
And it's true to say that climate change touches everything and everyone, but the impact of warming temperatures is different depending on where you are in the world. So Omar Ahmed asked, how has climate change affected third world countries?
It's really hard to tell, to pull out the signal of climate change so far from other things is a really tricky problem. But in general, if you are stressed by climate change in the agricultural sector, then that makes it much harder to do the things that we know that successfully developing countries have done in the past, of sort of like improving agricultural efficiency, urbanization, things like that. And there are some places where rain patterns are already changing a bit, and you don't know yet whether that's a variation in normal climate or climate change, but you absolutely know that rainfall patterns around the tropics will change quite a lot. El Nino frequencies will probably change, which will change the patterns of drought and of flooding. So we've seen large floods already, for instance, in Mozambique. It's all much harder if you don't have any resources to adapt to it. And if you don't have any resources to adapt to it, it hits you worse, so you don't build up the resources to adapt in the future. So there's a vicious circle here which kind of undermines an awful lot of what else is being done, mostly by developing countries, but also to some extent by the world community to hit the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's much harder to do that if the climate isn't the one that you're used to and is actively, it seems, working against you.
And we should also mention that we have a great piece in the Middle East and Africa section on how rising temperatures are making it even harder to reduce poverty in Malawi.
That's certainly true, yes.
So
it's a case example of that, yeah.
Yeah. On to the next question. Matt Cruz asked, how soon can we expect climate change to have a major detrimental impact on the global economy?
If only you had a sort of like way of running the world with climate change and without climate change, except that if you did have that, you'd just run it without climate change. So it's hard to, it's very hard to answer this one. Climate change is a very complicated thing, which doesn't mean people don't know quite a lot about it and know that it's going to be bad, but quantifying it is really difficult. There are different approaches to measuring the economic impacts of climate change that give you really quite different answers. And the other thing is, there's much less impact if you do more now than if you don't do more now. So these are all things which are relative to uncertainties both about how the economy works, about how nature works, and about what choices political entities, nations and, nations mainly, make about this. And so at the moment you can't point to anything and say, you can point to the economic costs of something like a hurricane, but you can't point to anything and say, that percentage point of world GDP, that was because of climate. In the long run, you can look at 3, 4, 5% of world GDP in various different projections. But I think that in the end, though the economics of how one tackles climate change are really important, looking for an economic reason, for an economic output from the climate change itself is not necessarily the best way of seeing it, even though I do believe that economic change is there.
We mentioned the protesters that are out today, and a lot of them are young students. We know that many of them believe that the only way to tackle climate change is by uprooting capitalism. What would you say to that?
Unsurprisingly, The Economist is not in favour of the uprooting of capitalism.
Yeah.
At the same time, if capitalism can't do a better job of responding to this crisis, then claims that other systems can do better will get stronger and stronger. So I think this is, it's important to remember that that fossil fuels are absolutely built into the same period of history that has seen the rise of capitalism throughout the world. And there is a view that without fossil fuels, you couldn't have had that sort of extraordinary growth in income, growth in wealth creation, growth in simple numbers of people. That may indeed be true. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change the system when you get rid of the fuels, but it does mean that it's a genuine question about how hard you try to do that. I think this is one thing I'm only going to be able to answer going backwards. I hope that liberal democracies with systems like the liberal democracies now use are able to respond to this well. And I think that they really have to try harder if they're going to convince the rest of the world of that.
We're going to have a look at some of the live questions now, people who are sending them in right now. There's one from Anupam Mishra who says, is there a need to change eating habits to tackle climate change?
If you can change a lot of people's eating habits, then that will make a difference. The problem is that if that changing your habits doesn't necessarily change other people's habits, and forcing people to change the way they eat is hard to do in a liberal way and obviously quite unpopular. If the whole world ate a lot less meat, then given the way that people now farm, there would be considerably lower emissions from agriculture. Now, it may be possible to lower the emissions from agriculture in other ways. There may also, for many people, be reasons not associated with the climate why they don't like the suffering of animals that get eaten.
Brilliant. And we're then now moving on to what people can do, which follows on quite nicely. So a few of you on the community tab had questions about what you could do as individuals. One of you even asked what activities your college environmental protection club could do. And Amit Yadav asked, what measures should an individual take to reverse the effects of climate change? What would you say?
Vote for people who want to do that. Most of climate change is a systems problem. There's lots of stuff you can do that will make your own personal contribution less, but you are one of 7.5 billion people. And that's a terrible problem because people obviously want to do things, and in most environmental situations there are things that individuals can do. And there are ways that you can lower your own individual carbon footprint, and that can give you a genuine benefit in feeling that you are not making other people's lives worse, but you're not actually making them better. The way to make them better is to act politically to try and get the systems, the ways energy is generated and things like that changed. That said, I personally fly less than I used to, though I still fly considerably more than the average person in Britain and far more than the average person around the world, but I try to fly on work-related things across continents. I try not to fly within Europe. But that's a pretty privileged position because I can sort of like afford or get other people to afford to pay for me to take trains, which are often more expensive.
I noticed that you tweeted once about the hashtag flight shaming.
Yeah, no,
what was your thinking behind that?
Well, I think given the fact that I write a lot about climate, both at The Economist and I've written books that have been a kind of about carbon and climate, it's not so much that I'm ashamed of flying, but I felt that given the way that people are thinking about this better and more critically, I felt that it was useful for me to be transparent about it. So when I fly, I now tend to tweet that I've flown and how much carbon is involved and what offsetter I've used to salve my conscience. Now, some people say, well, look, the plane flew anyway, so, you didn't really achieve anything. I didn't, but if more people think like this, then eventually there will be a lower demand for air travel, perhaps. I don't know that that's the case. So I'm in the same position as a lot of other people. I worry that I'm part of the problem, which I undoubtedly am. I know that I can be, I'm reasonably sure that by contributing to my colleagues' work in this issue, which I think is terrific, I've probably done a great deal more than avoid a flight to Copenhagen. But you do what you can, and it's about thinking about it as well as what you actually do.
Yeah.
If it build it into your thinking about the world that planes are linked to the climate, that's an important thing to do.
We've actually just had a live question in about transport related to that. So Patrick de Jong said, do you consider electric cars a good idea to tackle climate change?
Yes, but there's an important proviso. Electric cars are good, especially and particularly when the grid that's feeding them is good. If you're just making your electricity with coal over there and then using it in a car over here, there may or may not be, depending on your pattern of driving, there may or may not be efficiency gains. But if you can make the electric grid much, much greener, which we frankly know how to do, then yes, using electric cars is better. It's not an environmental panacea, but it definitely is going to be, I think, a big part of how we change transportation. I personally don't drive, but that's more because I've got hand-eye coordination problems and a bad temper, and also I live in a place with great public transport. If I did drive, I would almost certainly by now be buying a hybrid or an electric car.
And another live question we've just had in, what do you think about some of the young people who are striking today saying they're not planning to have children because of the fear of climate change?
It's very personal, isn't it? I don't have children, but that's not because of fear of climate change. I think that it's probably not the thing you should be thinking about most, because I do hear a lot of young people who seem to me to have an exaggerated idea of the personal effects of near-term climate change on them themselves. Climate change is mostly, as the IPCC points out, a problem for poor people and marginalized people in developing countries. It's a problem elsewhere as well, and it will get worse and worse, and I have no doubt that it could get very bad indeed. I'm not sure that you should build your entire life on a fear of the future, not least because you then slightly, again, as someone childless, I feel a little embarrassed telling anyone else what to do, but you kind of slightly reduce your stakes in the game, right? If you're saying, well, it's all going to go to shit and and everything's going to die, you may really want to do something about it, but you've slightly taken your finger off the pulse. So I would say make choices about how to have children on the basis of what you want and what people you love want and what you think the world, what role you think those children can play in the world. That would be my general advice.
Very interesting. And we have another question from the community tab, broadening it out again. Can we reverse climate change? Is it possible to reverse climate change?
It's possible, in theory, in the long term, to change the climate in other ways that make things colder. That's not quite the same as reversing climate change. So it's conceivable that using various forms of technology, you might suck all the carbon dioxide that humans have emitted back out of the atmosphere over the next 500 years or 300 years, rather than have it stick around for 10,000 years. So that's conceivable. That's not like saying reversing, it's not quite reversing climate change though, because it's not like the world will never have been heated up. It's just that it will have heated up and cooled down again. And so a lot of the effects, such as the people who had to move away from the shorelines or the things that have gone extinct, I actually have friends who want to bring back extinct animals, but that's a completely different story. It's that past doesn't go away. The suffering that people undergo doesn't go away. Similarly, there are ideas which I've actually written a book about trying to limit the amount of sunlight that comes into the Earth system so that the warming is not so intense. Not as an alternative to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but as a way of reducing some of the harm that goes on before those reductions get well underway. Again, though, that's not reverse. That's another climate change which you think might be a bit better and which would have its own complicated political outcomes. So you can't. There's no off switch. It's really difficult. But the idea that once the climate has changed for the worse, it can never, ever, ever get any better is one I think you should probably resist.
And we should mention that on our cover a few weeks ago, we had deforestation in the Amazon rainforest, which is accelerating. And we know now that it could be approaching a tipping point for which there's no going back. We had a film out this week about trees and climate change. And if you want to watch that, you can just click on the eye in the top right-hand corner of the screen. On to the next question.
Good.
Kyle Watt asked, this is from the community tab, what's better? Land used to plant trees or land used for solar panels? And can you even quantify that?
Oh, people have actually tried to quantify that quite a lot. It depends putting solar panels on is really useful if you are replacing other electricity that's being made in a dirty way.
Yeah.
So that's great. Or if you're providing people with electricity who otherwise would not have any electricity and want electricity, like, well over 1 billion people around the world, then they will say, this piece of land near me, please put solar panels on it. And I think that would be the right thing to do. You shouldn't build solar panels just for the hell of it, though. And there are some places which aren't well suited to solar energy where it might make more sense to plant trees. In general, though, the great thing about solar panels is the more of them we put out, the cheaper the next ones become, because there's this learning principle whereby the more solar panels we produce, the cheaper they become. This is not true of trees. Trees are very cheap, but they will always be basically the same thing. So at the moment, if your solar panel replaces coal-fired power, absolutely. If it adds power to people who need power, yes. If you're just doing it for bling, which I don't really think anyone is, or just a farm subsidy, then trees are nice. I do think that by and large trees are prettier than solar panels.
And any conversation about land, land is a finite resource. There is an issue with space. Mm-hmm. Any decision about what to do with a piece of land, you're not doing something else.
One of the reasons why some people, especially people, quite a lot of supposedly green energy, low emissions energy, is biomass energy. Yeah. And that's why there are some people who are very interested in the idea of growing more biomass at sea, where by and large no one wants to live. Yeah. And one of the advantages is that if you can encourage biomass at sea, you might also encourage, you'll get sort of like secondary benefits in terms of fish populations and things like that. So kelp is also part of the story as well as trees.
There's clearly growing public will for something to be done. But a lot of the people on our community tab were interested in whether policy can make a difference. Especially topical as this week is the UN Climate Action Summit in New York. Milan Prasad asked, have international bodies figured out any strict measures against countries destroying their forest cover and biosphere reserves?
No. They haven't. And there's a rough and ready rule in international relations. You can have strict measures on small things, or you can have that apply to a small group of countries, and you can have very loose measures on large things. And in climate, we're mostly on that, because you can't, the international community is not willing to go to war, to take the most extreme example, in order to save a bit of nature. Now you can put pressure, and you've seen this in Brazil. But so with questions about trade with the EU and whether new EU trade agreements would be put at risk by continuing deforestation. That's I think a legitimate tactic. At the moment, there's no concerted global way of doing that sort of thing. It's a bit sort of like case by case.
Yeah. A lot of questions just come in. Ayan Malik said, popular leaders like Donald Trump and Bolsonaro deny the existence of climate change. How do you combat this narrative?
Interesting. I don't think Donald Trump is a particularly popular leader. I mean, his ratings in the opinion polls are sort of like not particularly high.
Yeah.
There's not much you can do to such leaders. They obviously think, I don't know. I don't know if I really want to get into second guessing what people think. I don't think there's any remaining shred of credible evidence for standing on the position that humans aren't causing climate change. If you're doing that, you're doing it either because you're ignorant or because you actually have another agenda. And so I guess the answer is to tackle them on the other agenda. The other answer, of course, is to vote against them.
In your briefing paper this week, you wrote about how one of the challenges is that this is a collective action problem on a geopolitical level. Can you talk a bit about that and just explain why that's problematic?
There's this big problem that what happens to the climate in your country depends on what everybody does. So if you reduce your carbon emissions by a great deal and put a huge amount of effort into it and you're terribly hard on it and no one else does, you don't get a better world. You've just done something that has done. It's a bit like the situation just of the individual, frankly, that if you do your thing, you might feel better about it, but you haven't changed the world. So there's a great incentive on countries to have other people do stuff. And because if everyone else does stuff and you don't, then you get all the benefit without having put in any of the work. And that's what in game theory they call a collective action problem. And it's a real problem, I think, in climate change diplomacy. I mean, David Victor, who's one of the great experts on this, I think would say it's the biggest problem in international agreements on climate change, that you can't find a way, in reference to that earlier question about deforestation.
Yeah.
Nations don't have ways of forcing each other to do things against their interests, and most people who live in most nations kind of like this. They kind of like the idea that people elsewhere can't tell them what to do. And so when everyone has to do the same thing, but no one has to necessarily go first, you do get this stalling problem. Now there is one thing though, to maybe make it feel a bit better about this, or maybe makes me feel a bit better about this. Britain is reducing its carbon emissions and has reduced its carbon emissions down to the level of the late 19th century, which is kind of amazing, partly by developing offshore wind farms. Now, when this started off, offshore wind farms were extremely expensive. I mean, eye-wateringly expensive. But as a mixture of subsidies, genuine demand, and pretty well-directed technological improvement that was done by industry, but also to some extent by government, means that the price subsidy for those wind farms has plummeted. And we saw the new round of British wind farms announced today, and they are, sort of like 4 times less. There's 4 times less subsidy per megawatt hour than there was when they started off. So that's kind of amazing. Now, you can find people in Britain, and you obviously can say, well, we're still paying more for that energy than we would be if we were burning gas, and that's absolutely true. The good thing here is that the next generation of other nations that go for offshore wind power will start with the sort of technology that Britain has got to. Now, some people in Britain may say they didn't want to develop technology for other people, just as some people in Germany may say that, we've paid an awful lot of subsidies on solar panels to make them cheaper for everyone else. But that is one of the ways that cleaner technologies get cheap enough to use.
Great, and we've got one last question from the community tab, which is the Green New Deal enough to stop the climate crisis? The US lead note looks at Democratic candidates' big plans to deal with climate change. So have a read of that if you can. What would you say?
Goes back slightly to the collective action problem. Nothing that any given nation does responds to the problem at the level of the planet. America is a big emitter, but it's not the biggest emitter. And if it were to radically reduce its emissions, that would be a little bit good, but it doesn't solve the problem at the level of the planet. The Green New Deal isn't really as yet a policy. It's a sort of like space into which policies might fit to achieve some sort of like overarching radical reduction. There's a strong view that by running climate in with a lot of other issues, the Green New Deal, plays into Republican hands about what it is that green politics really is, that it's all about redistribution and things like that. And also there's a worry that it sort of like diffuses the energy around climate specifically. At the same time, I think it's absolutely clear that American climate policy could be considerably more ambitious, and I'm kind of glad that people are talking about more ambitious ways into it. Sometimes societies have to have big disagreements, and someone has to win and someone has to lose.
Ollie, we're running out of time. So I just wanted to ask you briefly, is there anything to be optimistic about?
I'm really terrible on the optimism question because I'm kind of like sort of like grumpy and pessimistic myself. There's something about being optimistic that there are definitely ways to have less harm and more harm. And we know a lot of things that can reduce the harm. Helping people in developing countries adapt to the climate they are already facing reduces harm. Reducing emissions through government action and through other means reduces harm in the long run. Can this be magically solved? Can it be solved as quickly as people in Extinction Rebellion and lots of the young people out demonstrating today are demanding? No, I honestly don't think it can. I think that there's a lot of climate change that's probably just going to happen. But that still means that you can protect people against the worst bits of it and do things to reduce how bad it gets. So you don't often hear Italian communists quoted at The Economist, but the Italian communist Gramsci wrote in his prison diaries that you must strive for pessimism of the intellect but optimism of the will. I'd say use the intellect to inform the will and try and find things you can improve, and then I think you've earned a bit of optimism, but you can't just have it for free.
Great note to end it on. We'll wrap it up there. If you want to find out more, then click on the I in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Next week, we've got a film coming out about how climate change is shaking up the insurance industry, so keep an eye out for that. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining us, Ollie.
Great pleasure.
Thank you for watching.